Hello, folks. This is video number 2 that you should have to watch online. This one um, hopefully goes a little smoother than the last as far as you getting here. Hopefully, everybody can get logged in and everybody's ready to go. Um, we're talking about today solving quadratic equations. Now, we did quadratic equations last year till the cows came home, so this should be all review. If there's any piece of this that you don't quite understand, feel free to re-watch that piece so you kind of have an understanding of what's going on before class tomorrow. Three main ways we solve these, three most common ways: factoring, completing the square, and using the quadratic formula, and we'll get into what the discriminant is um, in this video. So let's go ahead and get started. Factoring. Factoring, hopefully everybody understands this concept. What we're trying to find here to solve this is we're trying to find the zeros, okay, which again is we're dealing with the quadratic, so the graph of it is a parabola. We're trying to find the places where it crosses the x-axis. Okay, that is a 0 because we're trying to figure out where it is at 0. Okay, well, the first thing we need to do over here in order to find a 0 is we need to make sure it equals 0. So the first thing I'm going to do is just do a little algebra and add 11. So I've got 3x squared plus 10x plus 3, I don't need a parenthesis yet, equals 0. Now factoring, again we're trying to break it down into two multiplication pieces that I can work with because I've got an x squared and an x, and I need to get it just down to x so I can solve it. Okay, so factoring, how do we do this? Well, we need to find the factors of 3 and the factors of 3 in this case, some combination that are going to multiply and add to 10 when you multiply it back out or you FOIL it back out. Okay, well, the factors of 3 are just 3 and 1, so the only options I have are 3x and 1x. Now, the only options I have for the other 3 are 3 and 1, so I need some combination. Now, when I multiply those up, let me use green here. When I multiply those up, they add to 10x when I FOIL. Okay, well, I'm going to set it up like this, plus 3 plus 1, because when I multiply 3x and 3, I'm going to get 9x. And when I multiply 1 and x, I'm going to get an x. So that equals 10x, which is what I need right there. Okay? So I've kind of got a mess going, so let's rewrite what I have here. I factored it down to, factored it down to 3x plus 1 and x plus 3 equals 0. Okay, now if you recall, if I can make this part of the equation 0, and it's multiplied by this part, isn't 0 times anything 0? So what we do is we take each piece, 3x plus 1, and we set it equal to 0. And x plus 3, and we set it equal to 0, because wherever those x's equal 0 is where this thing is going to cross. So I go through and I algebraize and I solve, and I get 3x equals -1, x equals -1/3, and x equals -3. And we're in good shape. Okay? That is factoring. Those are my two zeros. Hopefully fairly straightforward. Next one we had was completing the square. Completing the square. Now, some things you needed to complete the square. Basically what we're trying to get with completing the square is we're trying to get a perfect square. So where we have something like x plus 7 squared equals 0, or equals whatever, equals any number really. Okay, because at this point I can take the square root of both sides, okay, and I end up with x plus 7 equals 0. keep solving x equals -7. That's what I need. I need this piece right here. I need a perfect square so that I can solve it. Well, how do I do that? Well, the first thing I have to do is make sure that the leading coefficient is 1. If the leading coefficient is not 1, I can't do it. So how do I make that 1? I'm going to divide everything by 2. This leaves me with x squared minus 6x minus 7/2 equals 0. Okay? Now, why am I not factoring like I did on the last one? Because that fraction is going to be a bear to factor. So I'm going to complete the square. Now, how do I do this? Well, if you recall from last year, what we do is we take the middle term, we cut it in half, and we square it. And it'll make sense why we do that. We cut it in half, so that's -3, and I square it. That's 9 minus 7/2. I have to keep that right there. Equals 0 plus 9. If I add 9 on one side, I have to add 9 on the other side. Now, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to factor this. And this is why I cut it in half and squared it. Because if I factor this, I end up with x minus 3 and x minus 3. Because -3 and -3 make -6. That's why I cut it in half. Because I needed to add up to -6. And then I squared it because -3 times -3 is a positive 9. So I cut it in half and square it. That factors there. Minus 7/2 equals 9. Okay, we're almost home. So now I can write this as x minus 3 squared, because it's the same thing squared. Minus 7/2 equals 9. Okay, well now let's add 7/2 to both sides. So I'm going to have x minus 3 squared equals, I'll get a common denominator right away, 18/2 plus 7/2. So I've got x minus 3 squared equals, where am I at here? 18 and 7 is 25/2. Okay, 25/2. Now what I have to do next, I have to take the square root of both sides, which that leaves me with x minus 3 equals 5 over the square root of 2. Remember, we don't like radicals in the denominator. So we're going to have to change that. So we have x minus 3 equals 5 root 2 over 2. If you don't know that simplification, remind me in class and I'll go over that. Okay, and then the last thing we've got to do is add 3. So, oh, and I almost forgot. Always remember, when you take a square root, it's always plus or minus. That could give us 2 answers. So x equals 3 plus or minus 5 root 2 over 2. There's my answer, and I've got 2 answers because of the plus or minus. That is completing the square. Okay? Next thing was a quadratic formula. Remember, this is where it comes from. It comes from the general form, and it comes from completing the square, with the general form. Okay, if I go through and I divide everything by a, and I get x squared equals, or x squared plus bx over a plus c over a equals 0, and then I cut the middle term in half and square it, and I go through all the algebra, and we'll go through all the algebra probably in class, I end up with a quadratic formula. X equals -b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. If you haven't learned that yet, learn it. It's a big one. It's huge. We use it all the time. So let's use the quadratic formula to solve this. Okay? Well, the first thing I need to do is get it in a general form. Remember, general form is ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So this thing has to equal 0. So let's subtract 4x to the other side. So I've got 2x squared minus 4x plus 7 equals 0. Now, quadratic formula, if you remember, x equals negative b plus or minus the square root b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. In this case, our a is the leading coefficient, which is 2 from right here. We'll go from right here. Our b is negative 4. And our c is 7. Okay? So now let's plug everything in. Negative b, always plug in parentheses, plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 ac all over 2a. And now we just go through and simplify. 4 plus or minus the square root of 16 minus 28 times 2 is 56 all over 4. Oh boy, this will be fun. 4 plus or minus the square root of negative 40 over 4. Now what are we going to do? We got 4 plus or minus the square root of negative 1. Break everything down. Square root of 4, square root of 10 over 4. So 4 plus or minus, let's see, we've got 2i root 10 over 4. So I can simplify everything here. This becomes a 2, this becomes a 2. 2 plus or minus I root 10 over 2, and there's your answer. Yes, it is okay to get imaginary answers because that means your graph never actually crossed the x-axis here. That's what imaginary numbers means. Okay? Now, getting into that. How do you tell how many answers you have? Well, we have to deal with the discriminant. The discriminant is the inside part of the quadratic, which is b squared minus 4ac. Now, why is this important? Well, if the answer to this piece right here is positive, what's going to happen? How many answers are we going to have? We're going to have 2 because it's plus or minus. If this answer is 0, we're going to have 1 answer because the whole thing cancels out. If this ends up being negative, I now have imaginary numbers. So how many real answers do I have? How many times does that thing cross the x-axis? 0. Okay? So the discriminant is b squared minus 4ac. Or not a squared, ac. Okay? If it's positive, you have 2 answers. If it's 0, you have 1 answer. If it's negative, you have 0 answers. Okay? So quick. Oh, solve this using any method. All right, we're going to have to hustle here. Let's take a look. If I subtract 1 over, I get x squared plus 6x minus 10 equals 0. The reason I subtracted that over is because I want to make it look like general form. I want it to equal 0. What do I like with this? I like completing the square because my leading coefficient is 1 and I have an even number in the middle. So here we go. X squared plus 6x. Cut 6 in half is 3 squared is 9 minus 10 equals 0 plus 9. So this part factors to x plus 3 squared minus 10 equals 9. So x plus 3 squared equals, I add 10 over 19. X plus 3 equals plus or minus the square root of 19. X equals negative 3 plus or minus the square root of 19. Okay? I know I went through that fast. If you need to pause it and go back, go ahead, but I got to keep myself under 15 minutes up here. Otherwise, YouTube won't let me load the video. So, let's review. We have factored, we've done all these in Algebra 2. We factored to where you figure out what's going to multiply and add to what. You complete the square, quadratic formula, negative b plus or minus square root b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Plug in your numbers and solve, and then use the discriminant. If you have any questions, please bring them to class.